Happy to welcome Greg Wrightstone back to the program. He's a geologist and the executive director of the CO2 Coalition and author of the upcoming book, Very Convenient Warming, How Modest Warming and More CO2 Are Benefiting Humanity. You can pick that up on December 8th. It's going to make you very popular with the mainstream media, Greg.
Yeah, I don't anticipate being on NBC, CBS, or NPR anytime soon.
No, despite the fact that you have a lot of evidence in this book, including it's like a chart-a-palooza in here. I mean, it's just constant charts and information here. You're not trying to be hyperbolic. You're trying to give people actual information about what's really happening.
Yeah, like the first book, Inconvenient Facts, I wrote this for the everyday Joe and Jane on the street that aren't scientists. It's not dumbed down, but I provide easily understandable charts and references, and it's all a lot of it's based from NASA, NOAA, National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. This is basic science data, but we're looking at it and interpreting a little bit differently. And the last time I was on with you, we talked about how there is no climate crisis. And I've really evolved since that point beyond that. Yes, there is no climate crisis, that's for sure. But what I find, and I explore in this book, is that by almost every metric, we see that Earth's ecosystems are thriving and prospering, and humanity is benefiting greatly from the combination of modest warming and more CO2, and that's to be celebrated.
Yeah, you really go through all of this information in the book, and I want to get to all of this if we can today. Let me start though with a quirky thing that you point out, which illustrates your overall point here. Tell me the connection between climate change and witches.
Oh,
this is fascinating.
It is fascinating. We see that Earth goes through cycles, and over the last several thousand years, I love the relationship between human history and climate history. And that relationship shows us that the previous warm periods were warmer than today, and they were hugely beneficial. Great civilizations and empires rose up during these really warm times, and then things became horrific when it started cooling. The last great warming period was called the medieval warm period, the time of the High Middle Ages. When you think about the great cathedrals being built, that's the High Middle Ages. And then things went horrifically wrong when it started cooling, and it led to crop failure, famine, pestilence, and mass depopulation. And it was blamed on weather-causing witches. That they said these weather-causing witches were causing this crop failure. And what's interesting, Stu, there were thousands of witches killed. In the book, I've got a chart where part of the chart shows witches killed per decade on the top, and actually really cold summers on the bottom, and the strong relationship. What's funny about 1540, the year 1540, it warmed up again, crops came back, the people were happy, the food was bountiful once again, and what they said was, we did really good, we killed all the witches. Now God is bestowing us with warm weather and huge harvests, and then it really started getting cold. And so today's witches are the fossil fuel companies and those people driving internal combustion engine cars. We're the witches that are being blamed for the horrific, and they aren't horrific, climate catastrophe that they're blaming on more CO2.
Yeah, it really is amazing. I mean, it gets cold, society gets worse, people don't know what to blame, they blame witches, they kill all the witches, it warms back up, they think they've solved the problem. It's amazing. Right. Let me talk about the difference between hot and cold here, because we have this, and you go back so far in history in the book, right? You go back so far. And we have this idea that history started like around 1800, right? Like when you look at these climate charts, you're in the mid 1800s and they start, showing you, oh, well, it's gone up since then. You go much farther back and look at the big picture in the book, and that's really important.
Yeah, indeed, and especially, particularly recently, they've been saying it's the hottest year ever, decade, whatever it is. And that's true if your record only goes back to 1850 or so, because think about it, we've been warming for more than 300 years, and we're in a warming trend. It's been warming in fits and starts. So, and I'm okay, again, looking back through human history, that's always been very good for humans during these warm periods. But if we look back through longer periods, back to the medieval warm period, it was warmer then than it is today. We know that through historical records of where were grapes being grown, and olive groves were much further north. I have a picture in the book there of my wife and I standing on the Mendenhall Glacier, and 1,000 feet below our feet, the glacier's retreating, but it's exposing mature forests from 1,000 years ago during this warm period. Think about it. So now we've got 1,000 feet of ice, and 1,000 years ago, this was a mature forest. It had to have been a lot warmer. The Vikings were growing barley on Greenland, which you can't do today. A lot of these historical facts we capture, and we also see too, for example, the greatest warm period during our first, it was called the Bronze Age, the Minoan warm period, really, really warm. We know that for, again, historical records, they were growing a crop called millet in Scandinavia, which can only be grown in semi-tropical climates in Scandinavia, so it had to have been a lot warmer.
Yeah, I mean, and I just pulling out this article. This is from pretty recently. Earth has its warmest October on record. This was all over the news constantly. The quote I loved was, "It is gobsmackingly hot." That was the term from the scientist. I don't know if scientists typically use the word gobsmackingly, but like this is the pitch from the media constantly. And one of the things I think we've lost sight of when we don't look back at real historical data is, you know, cold is worse for people. Like when you have, even today, cold winters kill far more people than hot summers. Is that right?
Oh, absolutely. The greatest study of its kind, Antonio Gasparini, looked at 74 million temperature-related deaths and concluded that 20 times as many people die due to cold as due to heat. 20 times. Another study was recent. It concluded 15 times. So what does that tell us? It tells us that global warming saves lives, and people's heads explode whenever you say that. But it's true that a warming climate will save many millions of lives from cold-related deaths.
Why is that so hard for, like, because I think we have this weird thing that we do as human beings. It's kind of part of our psychology, I think, where we think whatever it is now, we can't let that change. Like whatever it has been or what we're familiar with is the norm, and any change from that is bad. And that's where this comes from, it seems like. But like maybe change can be good too, right?
Well, change is good, and change is what the change that we are seeing now is just hugely beneficial. Probably the greatest aspect that we see, the combination of warming and more CO2 is leading to just an explosion of agricultural production. And in the book I capture, if you look at the top 8 crops that are being produced in the world by tonnage, those 8, if you just look at those, the growth, the crop production records, they're just breaking records year after year after year. It's due to warming temperatures means longer growing seasons. For example, in the continental United States, growing season has lengthened by 2 weeks since 1900. That means more plantings. Killing frosts stop earlier in the spring, arrive later in the fall. If you're a farmer, you're growing apples, what do you fear most? Late frost.
Frost, yeah.
And we don't have that now because we're having more warming. And so this is a blessing. So we're feeding a growing population.
Now, sometimes the critics of a climate skeptic like yourself might say, hey, yes, there's been warming before, we've seen it before, but this is much faster. I hear that one all the time. Like this, we've had these gradual rises and falls, but this is just extreme. It's too quick, we can't handle it.
Well, that's just not true. Actually, since 2016, a lot of these spikes of temperature are related to what's called an El Nino event.
Sure.
We saw the 98, 16. We're just starting one right now, and that might be spiking some of the temperatures. But since 2016, for 7 years, we had no warming. It was actually a slight decline. I haven't plugged in the last month or so of data, but up until last month, we've actually seen flat or slightly declining temperatures for the last 7 years. And if you look, when our warming period started, it was in the depths of the Little Ice Age. We know when it started. It was the year 1695. The next 40 years warmed at a rate 10 times what the 20th century rate was. So we've seen this before. And they're talking about it's unusual and unprecedented. No, it's not. You need to look at the full data set.
I think you look at I don't know, first world country, if you will, like the United States. We have been able to adapt to these things, right? And we know that climate-related deaths are way, way, way down over the last 100 years. That's all really positive. The left a lot of times, though, kind of comes at you with this attack of, it's not the rich countries you have to worry about. The rich countries called us all the problems. The poor countries, it's these island nations, these small island nations, they're going to be overcome by what is on the way, and they have no way to deal with it. The UN is talking now and starting a climate fund that's going to take money from rich countries, give it to poor countries. I mean, do they have anything on the smaller island nations?
Well, this is fascinating. The UN has a list of most at-risk islands. At top of their list are the Maldives and the Indian Ocean. It's only the highest point on the Maldives is 14 feet, and it's going to be underwater in a couple of decades, we're told. Well, okay, well, let's look at this. 15,000 years ago, the Maldives were also just above sea level. In the last 15,000 years, sea level has risen 400 feet. But here we are, the Maldives just above sea level. And these islands grow. It's a geologic process known as accretion. Accretions where the near shore face, the sands and the gravels during storms wash up on the island. It's a slow process, but it occurs over thousands of years. And so what they're telling you is, if we look at the rate of sea level rise today, by 2050, it will have risen another 2 inches, just about up to your ankles. So what they're telling you is that first 400 feet of sea level rise didn't put the islands underwater, but that next 2 inches, that'll do it. That'll put them underwater. No, it won't. Let me add one more thing.
Go ahead.
This is hugely important. If you Googled Maldives and Forbes, you'll see that there was an article in Forbes recently. There are 14 island resorts being constructed on the Maldives and 3 airports. So they're investing tens of millions of dollars, and it's being insured by multinational insurance companies. Insurance companies avoid risk like the plague.
Sure.
Are they going to insure something that's going to be underwater in 20 years? No, they're not going to do it because they know it's not going to be.
It's fascinating. It seems like they're speaking out of both sides of their mouth here. I want to come back on the other side and talk to you about the benefits of what we're looking at, the lies from the mainstream media, and a whole lot more on the climate. We're talking to Greg Wrightstone. He's the author of the upcoming book, A Very Convenient Warming, How Modest Warming and More CO2 Are Benefiting Humanity. You can pre-order it right now. We're back in a second. We're back with Greg Wrightstone, author of the upcoming book, A Very Convenient Warming, How Modest Warming and More CO2 Are Benefiting Humanity. It's available December 8th, wherever you get your books. You can pre-order it now. So the appeal to people's emotions on this topic is really powerful. I mean, people feel like the weather is not something that they can control. And so when someone says there's a huge tragedy coming your way, we saw this, when they started to try to sell us that the Maui fires were caused by climate change. It has a way of getting people activated. They feel, I need to do something. And the only thing they feel like they've been presented is we need to stop driving SUVs or something. The fires have really been a big push on this over the past few years. They tried this in Australia. They said, so much acreage had been burned. We find out later it wasn't really all that exceptional at all. In fact, it was kind of below average. Canada was a big push this past year. What is the actual truth when it comes to these wildfires? I mean, is climate change drying things out and making it worse?
No, actually, more CO2 leads to greater soil moisture content. I'm going to go into the details of the science. And no, globally, fires are not increasing. The Copernicus satellite was launched about 15 years ago. In using that, we can measure acreage burn globally, accurately. And we see there that acreage burn globally is declining significantly. We also see in the lower 48 states of the United States, the recent National Climate Assessment showed this shocking increase in area burned. You looked at it, but it wasn't in that report. They didn't source or reference it. And their chart started in 1983. Well, I found where it came from. It was from the National Interagency Fire Center. And that data goes back to 1926. They didn't show the old data. They only started in and why did they start in 1983? Because 1983 had the lowest both number and area burned in the 20th century. So if you're going to create a chart that shows an alarming increase in fires, started at the lowest point in the 20th century, which is what they did. Looking at the full data set, you'll see that fires in the 20s and the 30s and the 40s even were 5 times what they are today, both the number and the area burned in the United States. It is true portions of the western part of the United States, the Sierra Nevadas, we've seen an increase in large and intense fires, but that's a forest management problem, not a climate change related problem. We've gone away from managing our forests and in order to save these supposed endangered animals, when in fact the endangered animals are being killed with these large, intense fires from a poorly managed forest system.
This isn't a mistake. When they start a chart at the lowest possible point of a rise, and the lowest point in history, when they have previous data, that's not a mistake. They're manipulating people intentionally.
Another good example was a UN report last year was issued saying that there was a 5-fold rise in natural disasters. And I looked at that, and according to the chart they used, yeah, there was a 5-fold rise. It started in 1980, and there was a huge increase in natural disasters up to 2000, and then a decline. I contacted the person in charge of the data who admitted that, well, okay, you caught us. It was actually an increase in the stations. We started adding stations in 1980, and we finally built the stations out by the year 2000. And she admitted that there wasn't actually an increase in natural disasters, but rather an increase in reporting. And since that time, we've seen a 10% decline in natural disaster. And this is what they do. They manipulate, they torture the data, they torture the statistics, they start with their conclusion and fit the data to that conclusion.
Yeah, that's a real problem. I mean, you know, it's one thing to lie for political purposes, you're lying on social media. I mean, I would recommend doing anything that has "thou shalt not" in front of it. But when you're doing it in effort to secure millions, billions, I mean, globally, trillions of dollars that would be needed to fight this process, I mean, it feels more like a crime than just a little white lie. Yeah,
and as a scientist, it angers me. We should honor the scientific method, and part of that means there should be a robust debate. But we're people like me and my fellow scientists at the CO2 Coalition, we're being silenced, and we're not allowed to speak out. Fortunately, we've had a recent Nobel laureate in physics, Dr. John Clauser, who's unabashed and unafraid. In fact, he was at the White House being honored this past spring, and he told he shook Joe Biden's hand. He said, President Biden, he said, your science you're using for energy and climate is just wrong. And Joe Biden responded and said, you're just spouting right-wing science. And so Joe's lecturing the current Nobel laureate in physics.
No way, really?
But he's unafraid, and he's making a splash. It's hard to call him a science denier.
Yeah, very, very, very difficult to do so. Now, I do hear the kind of less science-based, but more experience-based stuff from people a lot. Even here in Texas, we went through a summer here this past summer that it was pretty hot here. I mean, there was a lot of 100-degree days. You know, every once in a while we seem to get hit with one of these summers. I remember, I think it was 2011, where it was really hot, and it seemed like every day for, I think it was 40-something days in a row. It was crazy, over 100 degrees. I mean, people think, hey, even if I don't want to stop driving my SUV, it does seem to be getting hotter. We are seeing more of these 100-degree days.
Well, actually, if we look at maximum temperatures and peak temperatures, I just looked at Texas. And I gave a presentation just a couple of hours ago, and I included Texas-specific data. And if we look at the percent of days above 100 degrees in Texas, there's no increase. There's a slight decline. And that data goes back to 1895.
Wow.
And we see maximum temperatures, we see the same thing. It's spiking up and down. Some years are hot. I mean, this summer, summer's the best time to be a climate alarmist, by the way, but you know, they were talking about hurricanes, fires, heat waves. Well, it's hurricane season and there are hurricanes. It's fire season and there are fires. And it's summer in Texas, and it's hot.
Yeah.
Okay.
Wow.
This happens.
Yeah.
But the fact is, you have to look at the science, the facts, and the data, and don't do it in a short period. Do it in a longer period to see the whole history.
Let's talk a little bit about climate models. One of the things I've been sort of obsessed with over the past few years is RCP 8.5, which they released a bunch of scenarios that could happen in the future. This is years and years ago. And 8.5 was like their worst case scenario, where they said, okay, everyone, I don't know, just turns their house into an oil, oil burning facility and just lets CO2 go into the air forever. And it skyrocketed the CO2 levels, and the temperatures skyrocketed along with all of those projections. I mean, is there any chance, now that we've gone through a good chunk of this time, that we could even come close to hitting the projections that they made at that time?
Well, we certainly haven't seen it in the data. If we look at the temperature data, again, we just talked about since 2016, the temperatures have been pretty flat. It goes up and down in spikes, but we have to look at, again, put this in the long-term perspective, and again, we just don't see this occurring.
Well, there's a chart in your book that shows all the various models, and it kind of gives a nice big fat line of the average of the projections going back many years and into the future. And it also, on the same chart, lays out what actually happened. And what you see there is far less warming than they projected.
That's correct. That was a chart done by Dr. John Christie, and it looks at the 100 models used by the IPCC and projects them, and then compares it to actual measured satellite data and also balloon data where they measure temperatures. This is real world data, and what they found that the modeled temperatures are 2.5 times too warm. They're greatly over predicting the warmth. In the tropics, it's even worse, 3 times. There was one climate model that got it right. It was the Russian model. But out of the 100 plus models, one model got pretty close to the right compared to the actual temperatures.
Yeah. And what's fascinating about this is not necessarily just that they got it wrong. Because look, I will say, my only defense of some of the climate stuff that we see is it's actually really hard, right? Like it's a lot of factors. It's a chaotic system. Predicting the temperature down to the 10th of a degree over a globe, it's, I would argue, impossible. But what is fascinating about this is they continue to use those high-end projections to give you the scary reports that you're getting, even though we know we're far enough into this process that we're never going to hit those projections.
Well, there was a recent study done. It was authored by Zeke Hausfather, who is one of the father. He's one of the top climate modelers, and he admitted, and his co-authors admit that our climate models we've been using are running what he called running too hot, and we have to take these and take another look at these things, because we're making decisions, policy decisions, tax decisions that are going to cost trillions of dollars just in the United States, based on these models. It's hard to predict. One of my favorite quotes is from Yogi Berra. Yogi said, typical Yogi, he says, it's really tough to make projections, especially about the future. And so that's a classic Yogi Berra.
And that's where we are basically right now. Let me go over to electric cars for a second. We're told that this can be the solution, right? We have all these big problems. They're very, very scary, but electric cars can be our path out of this. This is something that's making the environment much, much better. We are starting to see them sell a little bit more. Certainly, Elon Musk has, at least Teslas are selling relatively well. A lot of the other companies seem to be losing billions and billions of dollars off of trying this. I mean, you're a geologist, a lot of rare earth minerals going into this whole process. Give me the truth about electric cars. Well,
we can't get to where they want to be because of the supply chain and the amount of rare earths and critical minerals that are needed. Some of these in particular, what's not talked about, you've probably heard people talking about lithium and cobalt. Lithium's being mined, cobalt's being mined by child labor in the Congo. People are dying mining these things. But one of the biggest components that's needed for all of this is copper. And all of these, when you look at these elements and rare earth minerals that are needed, there's just not enough capacity to do it. There won't be any rare earth mines in the United States. It's a nasty, brutish process with open pit mines, and there won't be any of those, I doubt, in the United States. It's destined for third world developing nations where they have much relaxed, if you will, environmental policies that look the other way. And they'll destroy an area, mine it, and then walk away unreclaimed. We can't do that here in the United States.
Because then that's one of the darkest parts of this whole, spiel from them, because you have a situation where what they're doing is taking our negative effects and throwing them at poor people around the world, and then denying those same poor people fossil fuels in the future to make their lives better.
It is, and we can look too at the solar panels, industrial. Don't call them farms. These are industrial scale facilities. And the wind farms that are being, wind industrial scale wind facilities. The biofuels are horrific. In the Southeast Asia, they're cutting down mature forests and planting palm oil trees, monoculture. They're cutting down in Virginia and North Carolina, cutting down mature forests, turning them into pellets and shipping them to the United Kingdom. We're paving over our forests and grasslands with solar panels and wind turbines. It's almost as if we have to destroy the environment in order to save it. It's horrible.
We've got about a minute left here, Greg. What can we do? What should be the right path forward for America and the world?
We should utilize all of our resources for the betterment of mankind and do it as good stewards. Let me repeat that. Use all of our resources for the betterment of mankind and do it as good stewards. That's one sentence that encapsulates what we should be doing. You and I are both environmentalists. We care about our environment. We care about endangered animals. And we don't want to do anything to harm those. But right now, what I'm seeing, and based on my book, boy, I tell you, Earth's ecosystems are just thriving and prospering. It's truly something that we need to celebrate. I call it the greatest untold story of the 21st century.
The world is getting better, although I am a little bit hurt that you came on the show and accused me of being an environmentalist. I don't think I'm going to be able to get over that. A Very Convenient Warming, How Modest Warming and More CO2 Are Benefiting Humanity. The book is from Gregory Wrightstone, and it is going to be on sale in December. It's just a few weeks away, but get the pre-order in now. You watch this show. All we do is charts and data all the time. This thing is jam-packed. You are going to have more charts than you ever want to look at in this book. It's a great read, and it gives you all the information and makes it understandable for everyday people. Greg, thanks so much for coming on the program. I really appreciate you doing this.
Thanks for helping spread the news.